In the private papers of Carl Gustav Jung, housed within the carefully climate-controlled archives of the ETH in Zurich, there exists a collection of documents that few researchers dare to examine closely. These are not the published works that made Jung's reputation, nor the clinical case studies that populate his collected volumes. These are the personal records of experiments conducted in the laboratory of his own psyche, experiments so radical, so potentially destabilizing, that Jung himself warned they should never be undertaken lightly. He called them confrontations with the unconscious, but those who study them carefully recognize something more precise: systematic operations performed upon the soul itself, following protocols that bear an uncanny resemblance to the stages of the alchemical opus. The early decades of the 20th century witnessed Jung's descent into what he would later term his confrontation with the unconscious, a period of psychological crisis that began around 1913 and continued for several years. But to call this merely a crisis misses the essential nature of what Jung was attempting. He was not simply experiencing breakdown, he was conducting experiments. 4 specific operations, performed with the precision of an alchemist in his laboratory, each designed to accomplish a distinct transformation of consciousness. These were not metaphorical exercises or therapeutic techniques to be administered to patients. These were dangerous procedures carried out upon the only suitable material available for such work, his own psyche. The first experiment Jung conducted involved what he described as active imagination, though this clinical term barely captures the radical nature of the operation. In alchemical terms, this was the preparation of the prima materia, the raw, chaotic substance from which all transformation must begin. But Jung's prima materia was not lead or mercury. It was the contents of his own unconscious mind, deliberately provoked into manifestation through a technique that required him to voluntarily relinquish ego control and descend into fantasy. The procedure was deceptively simple in description, terrifyingly difficult in execution. Jung would seat himself in his study, consciously relax the grip of rational thought, and allow images to arise spontaneously from the depths. But unlike ordinary daydreaming or passive fantasy, he maintained a peculiar dual awareness, simultaneously immersed in the images and capable of observing them, even interacting with them. He was both participant and witness, subject and experimenter, the alchemist and the substance being transformed. What emerged from these sessions was not random psychological noise, but coherent, autonomous figures, personifications of unconscious contents that possessed their own consistency, their own apparent autonomy, their own intelligence. Jung encountered Elijah and Salome, Philemon, the ancient guru, the dark figure he called Ka, and a multitude of other entities that seemed to exist in an interior realm as real and objective as the outer world. The critical insight, and this was what made the experiment so dangerous, was that Jung took these figures seriously, not as symptoms of mental illness, not as mere projections of his own mind, but as genuinely autonomous psychic realities with which he needed to establish relationship. The alchemical parallel is precise. The alchemists spoke of bringing the invisible into visibility, of giving form to the formless, of extracting the hidden spirit from base matter. Jung was performing exactly this operation, but the matter was psychological. The spirit was autonomous complexes of the unconscious, and the laboratory was the interior space he accessed through active imagination. The vessel in which this operation occurred was what he would later call the temenos, a sacred psychological space that had to be carefully protected and maintained for the work to proceed. The second experiment built directly upon the first and involved what Jung termed the integration of the shadow. If active imagination was the preparation of the prima materia, shadow integration was the beginning of the nigredo proper, the blackening, the putrefaction, the confrontation with everything consciousness wishes to deny and repress. But Jung's approach to the shadow was not the therapeutic integration that would later be taught in Jungian analysis. This was something far more radical and dangerous. Jung discovered through his experiments that the shadow is not simply one's personal unconscious contents, the forgotten memories and repressed desires of individual history. Beneath the personal shadow lies a deeper, more archaic darkness, the collective shadow, the reservoir of human evil and destructiveness that every individual carries as part of their phylogenetic inheritance. To truly integrate the shadow meant to recognize one's capacity for absolute evil, not as an abstract philosophical position, but as a lived, felt reality. The experiment required Jung to identify and consciously acknowledge every aspect of himself that contradicted his self-image as a civilized, moral, rational human being. But the critical operation, the one that distinguishes mere recognition from true integration, was that Jung had to find a way to accept these contents without identifying with them, to hold them in consciousness without either repressing them or being possessed by them. This is the alchemical principle of solvet coagula taken to its psychological extreme. Dissolve the false unity of the ego ideal, then reconstitute a more comprehensive identity that can contain light and darkness simultaneously. The phenomenology of this process is rarely discussed in polite psychological discourse, but Jung's personal records make it clear. He experienced profound moral vertigo, moments when the distinction between good and evil seemed to dissolve, when he could feel in himself the same impulses that drove history's greatest atrocities. He recognized his own capacity for cruelty, for manipulation, for destructive rage, and the critical insight was that these were not aberrations to be eliminated, but essential components of the complete human being that had to be integrated into consciousness. The danger of this operation cannot be overstated. Many individuals who attempt shadow integration prematurely or without proper containment become possessed by the very contents they are trying to integrate. They either act out the shadow, becoming what they feared, or they repress it more deeply, developing what Jung called a negative inflation, an unconscious identification with evil that manifests as cynicism, nihilism, or destructive behavior rationalized as authentic self-expression. Jung himself teetered on the edge of this abyss multiple times during his experiments. The third experiment Jung conducted involved the operation he would later theorize as the coniunctio oppositorum, the union of opposites. In alchemical symbolism, this is often depicted as the chemical wedding, the sacred marriage of king and queen, sun and moon, sulfur and mercury. But the psychological reality Jung discovered was more complex and more disturbing than these beautiful symbols suggest. Through his active imagination work, Jung encountered what he termed the anima, the unconscious feminine aspect of his male psyche. But this was not the gentle, nurturing feminine of sentimental spirituality. The anima figure that emerged in Jung's experiments was capricious, seductive, dangerous, capable of plunging him into depths of emotion that threatened to overwhelm his rational faculties. She appeared in multiple forms, sometimes as Salome, the dangerous temptress, sometimes as a patient guide, sometimes as a destructive force that seemed bent on his psychological annihilation. The experiment Jung conducted was to enter into relationship with this figure, to engage her in dialogue, to differentiate her autonomous nature from his projections upon her. This was not integration in the sense of absorbing the anima into ego consciousness. Rather, it was the establishment of a conscious relationship between ego and unconscious that respected the autonomy of both poles. The alchemical parallel is the careful combination of opposites that must be neither too rapid, producing explosion, nor too slow, producing no transformation at all. Jung discovered that the union of opposites is not a comfortable synthesis or a pleasant merging, but a holding of tension that can feel unbearable. To maintain conscious relationship with the anima meant to be perpetually pulled between masculine and feminine modes of consciousness, between rationality and emotion, between activity and receptivity, without collapsing into either pole or escaping into a false transcendence that denies the opposition. The psychological vessel that contains this operation is consciousness itself, expanded and strengthened through the previous experiments until it can hold what would normally tear the psyche apart. The phenomenology Jung described is illuminating. He experienced periods of profound emotional volatility, times when he could barely function in his professional or personal life because the anima was constellated so powerfully. He struggled with projections onto actual women, seeing them through the lens of his interior feminine figure, then slowly learning to distinguish the real person from the archetypal content he carried. He discovered that authentic relationship, whether with another person or with an interior figure, requires the maintenance of tension between separate poles rather than merger or domination. The fourth and final experiment Jung conducted was perhaps the most esoteric and the most dangerous of all. He called it the individuation process. But this term has been so diluted by popular psychology that its original meaning is nearly lost. For Jung, individuation was not self-improvement or the achievement of psychological health. It was the creation of the self, capital S, the totality of conscious and unconscious that transcends and includes the ego. The alchemical parallel is the creation of the philosopher's stone, the lapis philosophorum, the incorruptible body that results from the successful completion of the great work. But Jung's discovery was that this stone is not an achievement or an object, but a process, a dynamic relationship between ego and self that must be continuously renewed. The experiment involved what he termed circumambulation, the careful, repetitive circling around the self, approaching it from multiple angles, never grasping it directly, but allowing its gradual manifestation through symbols. Jung documented this process through his creation of what would later be published as the Red Book, though this description makes the work sound more literary than it was. The Red Book was Jung's laboratory notebook, the record of his experiments in active imagination, his encounters with autonomous figures, his dreams, his visions, his mandalas. The mandala drawings in particular served a specific experimental function. They were attempts to give form to the self, to create a symbolic container that could hold the totality of opposites without disintegrating. The critical insight Jung gained from this fourth experiment was that the self cannot be achieved or attained in any conventional sense. It is not the result of successful shadow integration or anima-animus work, though these are prerequisites. The self emerges spontaneously when the psyche is prepared to receive it, and its emergence often takes forms that are terrifying rather than comforting. Jung encountered the self variously as Philemon, as Christ-like figures, as mandalas, as the union of good and evil, as a totality that transcended his capacity to comprehend it rationally. The experimental protocol Jung developed for this final operation involved a kind of active receptivity, maintaining consciousness without grasping, observing without interpreting, allowing without passivity. He had to become a vessel, sensitive enough to detect the subtle manifestations of the self, while strong enough to contain their overwhelming numinosity without being possessed. This is the alchemical vessel brought to its highest development, capable of containing divine fire without cracking. The danger of this experiment is different from the others. While shadow integration risks possession by evil, and anima work risks emotional overwhelm, the premature constellation of the self risks what Jung called inflation, the ego's identification with archetypal contents that properly belong to the transpersonal realm. Jung himself experienced periods of inflation during his experiments, times when he felt like a prophet or a religious founder, when the line between his personal psychology and collective archetypal processes became dangerously blurred. What sustained Jung through these experiments was not courage or willpower alone, though both were required in abundance. It was his commitment to a particular kind of consciousness that he termed psychological honesty, the willingness to observe and record without premature interpretation, to follow the phenomena wherever they led, to resist both the inflation of believing he had discovered ultimate truth and the deflation of dismissing his experiences as mere fantasy or pathology. The successful completion of Jung's 4 experiments did not result in a perfected, finished self. What emerged was something stranger and more valuable, a personality capable of holding the tension of opposites without collapsing, conscious of both its light and darkness without being possessed by either, in relationship with the unconscious without being overwhelmed by it, oriented toward the self without identifying with it. Jung became, in the alchemical sense, a living vessel capable of containing the opus, the work itself. The implications of these experiments extend far beyond personal psychology. Jung recognized that he was not exploring merely his own psyche, but mapping territory that exists in every human soul. The autonomous figures he encountered, the stages of transformation he documented, the dangers and breakthroughs he experienced, these are universal structures of human consciousness, not personal peculiarities. His experiments were possible because he volunteered to serve as the experimental material, to undergo the operations himself, so that he could report back to consciousness what he found. But here we encounter the essential paradox of Jung's experimental work. While the structures he discovered are universal, the experiments themselves cannot be replicated in any simple sense. Each individual must conduct their own experiments, must discover their own shadow, must encounter their own anima or animus, must approach their own self through their own unique circumambulation. Jung's laboratory notebooks provide a map, but the territory must be traversed personally, and the dangers are real, not metaphorical. The question that emerges from studying Jung's experiments is not whether one should attempt such operations. Many are called to this work regardless of choice, but whether one is prepared for what will be demanded. These experiments require the construction of a psychological vessel strong enough to contain transformation without shattering. They require the kind of honesty that can observe one's own darkness without flinching. They require the capacity to maintain consciousness through experiences that would ordinarily produce breakdown or escape into psychosis or spiritual inflation. Jung himself was ambivalent about sharing the details of his experiments. He published theoretical works describing individuation, shadow integration, and the confrontation with the unconscious, but he kept his personal Red Book private during his lifetime, recognizing that the raw material of his experiments might be misunderstood or prematurely imitated by those unprepared for such work. The experiments he conducted were not therapeutic techniques to be casually applied, but sacred operations that transformed the experimenter as much as they revealed psychological truth. The legacy of Jung's experiments lies not in a method that can be taught, but in a possibility that can be recognized. The possibility that consciousness itself can be expanded through deliberate operations conducted upon one's own psyche. The possibility that the unconscious contains not just repressed personal content, but autonomous intelligences that can be encountered and related to. The possibility that the self one knows is not fixed, but can undergo radical transformation through a process that resembles death and rebirth. The possibility that the alchemists were describing literal operations performed not on base metals, but on the base matter of unconscious existence itself. In the final analysis, Jung's 4 experiments reveal the secret that the alchemists encoded in their cryptic symbols and recipes. The laboratory is interior, the matter is psychic substance, the fire is conscious attention sustained at unbearable intensity. The vessel is consciousness itself expanded to hold what ordinarily cannot be contained, and the gold that results is not perfection, but wholeness, the terrible. beautiful totality of all that a human being can become when they dare to transform the raw material of their own existence into something conscious, integrated, and paradoxically complete. The experiments continue. Every individual who voluntarily descends into their own darkness, who encounters the autonomous figures that inhabit the interior landscape, who maintains consciousness through the dissolution of their familiar identity, who approaches the self with humility and trembling, every such individual is conducting the same experiments Jung pioneered. The laboratory remains open, the operations await, and the prima materia of unconscious existence is always available for those with sufficient courage to begin the work. The question is not whether the experiments are possible, but whether you are prepared for what you will become when the operations are complete. The answer to that question cannot be given in advance. It can only be discovered through the experiment itself.